She felt the harsh grip of her manager on her hair. A sudden, painful yank under the watchful eyes of over 50 diners. A burning sensation shot across her scalp, stealing her breath. An awkward laughter from a nearby table sliced through the thick, oppressive air. She felt exposed, diminished, and utterly humiliated. Then, at table 7, where the light danced on the fabric of a finely tailored gray suit, a man stood up. His voice, though quiet and cold, resonated with undeniable power. "Let her go," he stated. "No need for shouting. No need for threats." Those simple words landed with the force of a direct order. Silence blanketed the restaurant. Little did Emily Carter know that the man who had just defended her, Nathan Mell, had vowed to never involve himself in violence again. And in the very instant he stood up for her, he was already plunging back into the darkness he had struggled for years to escape. That night, Verona House glittered, a stage set for elegance. Candlelight flickered on crimson wine. The soft strains of jazz mingled with the delicate clinking of silverware, and the rich aroma of sizzling steak filled the air. Emily had been rushing from table to table for 2 solid hours, beads of sweat gathering beneath her white shirt. She'd been working there for 8 months, long enough to learn that one small slip-up could cost her more than just her pride. Kyle Mercer, the restaurant manager, never hesitated to publicly humiliate his employees. When the glass of Pinot Noir escaped her grasp and spilled across the beige evening gown of a VIP guest, time seemed to grind to a halt. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Kyle was already charging toward her, face red with anger, his voice cutting through the music like a knife. "You just cost this restaurant $700, you idiot." And before Emily could even react, his hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her down as if she were a misbehaving child. Gasps rippled through the room. Chairs scraped against the floor. And then silence. A man stood up. Nathan Mell from table 7. His steely gray eyes locked onto Kyle's. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke, each word slow and precise. "Let her go if you want to keep that hand of yours." The sound of his voice seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Kyle looked up, ready to argue, but something in Nathan's gaze made him recoil, releasing his grip. Emily stumbled, almost falling, but Nathan's hand caught her shoulder, firm yet gentle. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and tinged with concern. She was speechless, able only to nod. The man paid his bill and left without another word, leaving a single business card neatly on the counter. When Emily picked it up, it read, "Nathan Mell, Mela Holdings." Behind her, someone whispered, "Mela? Isn't that the name of the Mafia boss who used to run Chicago?" As the room slowly returned to its polished composure, Emily stood frozen in the middle of the floor, her hair disheveled, her heart pounding in her chest. She had just been rescued, and every instinct told her this was more than a simple act of kindness. Outside, the first snow of the season drifted softly over Michigan Avenue. Nathan sat in his black car, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He had promised himself he would never be involved in violence again, that the name Mela would become nothing more than a forgotten relic of his past. But when he witnessed that man yank the young woman's hair in front of everyone, he couldn't remain seated under the streetlights. He looked at the spare business card he had given her, his sigh disappearing into the misty air. He knew that once she reached out, everything would begin to change for both of them. That night, back in her small rented room in South Chicago, Emily placed the card on the table and stared at it for what seemed like an eternity. A stranger, a single act that appeared almost accidental, and yet it had shaken her world to its very core. She didn't know it then, but the red wine that had spilled that night would ignite a fire that would burn brighter than a lifetime. A fire named love, redemption, and destiny. Before we continue, if you felt your heart flutter when Nathan Mell stood up to defend Emily, subscribe to Underworld Love Stories to hear more emotional, dramatic, and surprising love stories every day. Hit like if you believe that a single moment of courage can change a person's life. And let us know where you're listening to this story. Comment with your city or country so we know where in the world the journey of underworld love stories has touched your heart. Now, let's return to Chicago, where Emily Carter is about to face a man named Mel, and fate begins to weave its intricate threads. The next morning, Chicago lay under a thin veil of mist, sunlight weakly piercing through the towering glass buildings. Emily Carter stepped into Verona House, dark circles shadowing her eyes. Having not slept a wink, she still couldn't believe what had happened the night before. The image of Kyle Mercer yanking her hair, the murmurs from the tables, and the man at table 7, Nathan Mell, rising like a sudden gust of wind, kept replaying in her mind like a flickering film reel. But this morning the restaurant looked different. A notice was taped to the front door, temporarily closed for management restructuring. The staff huddled in small groups, their faces pale and worried, their whispers hushed. "Haven't you heard?" a waitress murmured. "After what happened last night, Kyle was fired. Verona House has a new owner." Emily froze. "A new owner?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Who bought it?" The answer came from behind her. "Mel Holdings." The words hung in the air, heavy and still. Someone dropped a tray. The metallic clang echoed across the floor. Silence followed. A chill crept down Emily's spine. Mela, the name conjured up old newspaper clippings, stories of the Italian Mafia that had once ruled Chicago 2 decades ago. She had always dismissed them as urban legends. And now that legend had taken over the place where she worked. The office door opened, and a legal representative stepped out, announcing curtly, "As of today, Verona House is officially under the ownership of Mr. Nathan Mell. All employees are to take a 3-day leave until further notice." Emily took a step back, dizzy with confusion and unease. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or afraid. The man who had defended her the night before was now the new master of the small world she clung to. When the crowd dispersed, she remained alone in the empty dining room, where the crystal glasses still caught faint shards of morning light. On the counter lay a white envelope, neatly placed, her name written across it in careful handwriting. Inside was the same business card she had held the night before, along with a line written in blue ink. "If you still wish to work, meet me at 10 a.m. tomorrow at the cafe on Monroe Street." Below it was the signature, Nathan Mell. Her heartbeat quickened, partly fear, partly curiosity. She looked around. Everything felt quieter than ever. Only the faint scent of red wine lingered on the floor, the last trace of that fateful night. That afternoon, Emily sat in her small 3rd-floor apartment in South Loop, staring out at the line of cars crawling beneath the gray sky. Her mother had once told her, "Never let anyone make you feel small, not even if they're the ones paying you." But last night, she had done nothing but tremble and bow her head. Now someone had stood up for her, but that man bore the name Mel. She didn't know whether to trust in kindness or brace herself against danger. She picked up her phone and typed Nathan Mell into the search bar. Dozens of headlines appeared. Only son of the late Mafia boss Vincent Mell, key witness in the 2012 financial case, vanished from the business world after his father's death. Emily swallowed hard. She remembered his eyes from the night before, calm, yet filled with something that seemed to be warring within himself. She turned off the screen, leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling streaked with pale light. Part of her wanted to forget, to walk away, to find another job and live quietly. But another part, deeper and impossible to explain, wanted to understand why a man like him had stood up for her, and why he now wanted to see her alone. The next morning, she dressed in a simple dress, tied her hair neatly, her heart pounding with each beat. Outside, the snow was melting, the sky turning clear. She knew she was stepping into something unpredictable. Yet, she also knew there were moments in life that, if you didn't seize them, you'd regret them forever. Emily slipped on her coat, took the business card, and stepped out the door. At the corner of Monroe Street, a small cafe awaited, and with it, the man who had silenced an entire restaurant with a single sentence. That morning, the cafe on Monroe Street was awash in the warm glow of winter light streaming through the window panes. Emily Carter stood outside, clutching the strap of her bag, her heart fluttering with unease. She had arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of politeness, partly because she couldn't bear the thought of making a man named Mela wait. When she stepped inside, the scent of roasted coffee mingled with the sweet aroma of baked pastries, making her throat go dry. In the far corner near the window, Nathan Mell sat alone. He wore a crisp white shirt beneath a black wool coat, the top button undone, a look that was both composed and effortlessly relaxed. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod, gesturing for her to come over. Emily took a deep breath and walked toward him, sitting down across the table. His voice, low and steady, carried a gentleness, as if he were afraid of intimidating her. "Thank you for coming," he said. She nodded and answered softly, "I should be the one thanking you for last night." He shook his head, his gaze devoid of pride. "No need for thanks. I just can't stand seeing someone humiliated while everyone else looks away." Nathan paused for a moment, then added quietly, "My mother used to be a waitress. She was treated badly, exactly like that. Maybe I saw her in you." Emily looked up, startled. The light caught his eyes, weary yet sincere. "Is she still alive?" she asked gently. Nathan turned toward the window, where the snow was melting on the rooftops. "No, she died when I was 20, before I ever had the chance to make her proud of me." The sentence was brief, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Emily said nothing. Something inside her tightened. There was a gravity in him that didn't belong to the businessmen she'd met before. No boasting, no pretense. Only a quiet sorrow etched deep as time. The waiter brought over their coffees. Nathan gave a polite nod of thanks, then pushed a small espresso cup toward her. "I figured you'd prefer a medium roast," he said, almost teasingly. She blinked in surprise. "I never mentioned that." He smiled faintly. "I observed it. People who aren't used to pretending don't order cappuccino in a crowded restaurant. You chose espresso. It's quick, efficient, easy to control." She smiled, easing into the moment without realizing it. "So, you observe people that closely, do you?" she said playfully, then fell silent when she saw he wasn't laughing. Nathan set his cup down, his hands clasped loosely together. "I bought Verona House," he said simply. "Not just because of you, but because I want to turn it into something different. A place where no one gets humiliated just because someone else holds the power. A brasserie." Emily looked up, her eyes uncertain. "You want me to go back there to work?" He nodded. "Not as a waitress. I need someone who can see people, not just the food they serve. You have that instinct." She let out a small laugh, part disbelief, part wonder. "I'm just a girl who carries wine trays, Mr. Mell. You're overestimating me." His reply came slow but firm. "I never say what I don't believe." In that instant, the silence between them lost its tension. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pastries through the open door, and the soft jingle of a bell mingled with the murmured voices of strangers. Emily felt her heart beating faster, not out of fear, but because something warm and unfamiliar was stirring beneath her doubts. Nathan reached into his coat and laid a single sheet of paper on the table. "This is a temporary contract," he said. "You'll help me rebuild Verona House, the staff, the system, the spirit of the place. Triple the pay and 1% equity." She looked down at the paper, then back at him. "Why me?" His gaze held hers. "Because you don't pretend, Emily. And in a world full of performances, that's the rarest thing of all." His words awakened something in her, something long dormant, something that felt like belief. She didn't sign then and there, but she didn't refuse either. When she rose to leave, she glanced back once. Nathan was still seated by the window, the sunlight tracing his face, bright, yet shadowed. Outside, the Chicago sky was clearer than it had been in days. And inside her, a question began to take shape. Had this man saved her from humiliation, or had he unknowingly led her into a world far more dangerous than she could ever imagine? That evening, Emily Carter sat alone in her small apartment, the contract from Nathan Mell spread out before her, the fine white paper reflecting the soft amber glow of the lamp. She had read it over and over, searching for something hidden between the lines, 3 times her current pay, a 6-month term, full decision-making authority, and one final note written in blue ink, "You'll be my equal, not my employee." That line unsettled her the most. Equal, a word so simple, yet could it truly exist in the world of men like Nathan? She closed her eyes and thought of that morning at the cafe. His calm gaze, the low rasp of his voice when he spoke of his mother. Nothing in him had felt rehearsed. Still, part of her hesitated to trust. Yet, as she looked around the cramped apartment, hearing the wind slip through the cracks in the window frame, she knew she couldn't go on living in fear. Perhaps this was the rare chance life was offering her, or a door opening into something darker. But either way, she had to walk through it. The next day, Emily arrived at the Mel Holdings building, a name that alone made her chest tighten. The office was on the 17th floor, its glass walls offering a sweeping view of Chicago. Nathan stood by the window, hands in his pockets, the light tracing a faint halo along his shoulders. When she entered, he turned, his eyes gentler than she expected. "I didn't think you'd come this soon," he said. "I don't like keeping people waiting," she replied, steadying her voice. He nodded slightly and motioned for her to sit. A cup of coffee steamed in the center of the table, its familiar scent calming her just enough to breathe evenly again. "I want you to understand something," Nathan began, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't an ordinary job. Verona House was a place my mother and I used to go when I was a boy. I bought it back not just as an investment, but as a way to make amends. I want it to be a place where women like her, like you, never have to bow their heads again. Understand?" Emily looked at him and saw in his steely gray eyes a strange kind of light, not power, but the glimmer of someone who had lost something long ago and was still fighting to reclaim it. "You really think I can do that?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly, without hesitation. "I'm not hiring you for your resume. I chose you because of the integrity I saw in you that night. The way you stood up, even when the entire room was staring." She stayed silent for a long moment, then drew a deep breath and picked up the pen. The sound of its tip against paper landed like a quiet seal on fate. When she set it down, Nathan tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. "Good. From now on, we're partners." He extended his hand. She hesitated, then took it. His palm was warm, his grip firm yet gentle enough to send a tremor through her chest. "One more thing," he said as she started to rise. "You'll have full authority over hiring and retraining the staff. But if you ever need me, just call." "Do you really believe I won't mess everything up?" she asked, half teasing, half uncertain. Nathan's reply was quiet but unyielding. "If I didn't believe in you, I wouldn't have brought you into my world." Those last words stopped her cold. His world. The phrase sounded both inviting and dangerous. She left the office, her thoughts a tangled rush of emotions. As the elevator doors closed, she caught a glimpse of Nathan still standing by the window, coffee cup in hand, gazing down at the city like a man waging war against his own memories. Outside, Chicago burned with the red glow of sunset, the light reflecting off the skyscrapers in streaks like slow-moving fire. Emily clutched her bag and stepped into the cold wind that lashed her face. She knew that from the moment her pen touched the paper, her life would never be the same. Yet beneath the fear and the uncertainty, something else stirred, a fragile spark of trust, an unspoken promise. And though reason urged her to be cautious, her heart whispered just one truth. Perhaps, for the first time, she had found someone who truly saw her in a world built on pretense. 3 days later, Verona House opened its doors once more. Morning light streamed through the tall glass panels, glinting off the empty rows of tables and the new white curtains that had just been hung. The faint smell of fresh paint mingled with the scent of polished wood from the bar, filling the air with something both clean and unfamiliar, the kind of stillness that comes before a new beginning. Emily Carter stepped inside, holding a folder of recruitment papers she had stayed up late the night before to finish. Nathan Mel stood in the middle of the dining room, his white shirt sleeves rolled up as he worked with a carpenter to adjust the new sign. The sight stopped her for a moment. There was no trace of the immaculate suit or distant composure. He looked like an ordinary man, someone trying to rebuild from the ground up. When he noticed her, Nathan smiled, a brief, quiet smile. "Right on time," he said, his familiar low voice carrying warmth. "I didn't want to keep my new partner waiting," she answered. He nodded and motioned for her to follow him into the kitchen. A bright space gleaming with new pans, knives, and trays neatly arranged on stainless steel counters. "I want you to look over the equipment list and the new procedures before we reopen," he said. "We're going to do things differently. Not just the menu, but how people are treated here." Emily looked around and nodded slightly. "We," she repeated, putting gentle emphasis on the word, as if to test whether he truly saw her as a partner or just an employee. Nathan met her gaze. "I told you before, you're my partner. I want you to teach them something I never learned, respect." The simplicity of his words caught her off guard. In a world of power and hierarchy, humility like that was rare. They spent the morning checking every detail, from the arrangement of the tables to the greeting protocol at the door. Emily suggested abolishing the supervisor position that thrived on yelling, replacing it with a rotating team leader each week so that everyone could learn to listen to one another. Nathan listened carefully, jotting down notes without interrupting. Occasionally, his eyes lingered on her a little longer than necessary, as though he wanted to say something but wasn't quite ready to. By noon, they sat in a corner of the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the steady hum of the oven. Emily spread out her notebook, pointing to the last page. "I think Verona House should start by changing how people feel when they walk in, not just what they eat. A dinner doesn't need to be perfect, but it should have a soul." Nathan looked at her and nodded slowly. "You sound just like my mother. She used to say, 'Food is only an excuse, a reason for people to find one another.'" His voice softened on those last words, as if brushing against a memory that still hurt, and his eyes carried a tenderness that surprised her. Emily sat still, realizing she was seeing a side of him no one else had, not the male name that inspired fear, but the man himself. As they walked together into the main dining room, the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, casting their shadows across the floor. He stopped and said quietly, "If you see something that doesn't feel right, tell me. I'm not good with people, but I want to learn." She turned toward him, her tone gentler than usual. "And I'm not good at trusting, but I'll try today." Her words drew a rare smile from him, the kind that melted the coolness he usually wore like armor. When she left the restaurant that evening, the city of Chicago had already lit up, its reflection shimmering across the lake. Emily paused by the glass door, looking up at the new sign, Verona House, glowing softly beneath the golden light, and just below it, a handwritten slogan Nathan had chalked in himself, "Built not to impress, but to heal, is another indeed." She smiled and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, fear no longer filled every corner of her heart. Perhaps among the fresh paint, the new bricks, and the people starting over, she too was being reborn alongside the man who had once silenced an entire restaurant with a single sentence. That night, long after everyone had left Verona House, the lights in the kitchen still glowed. Emily Carter sat at the bar, flipping through her notebook, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock. She was about to leave when she heard slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway. Nathan Mell appeared, his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, a small paper bag of ingredients in his hand. He no longer looked like the composed businessman she had met, but like a chef preparing something private, something personal. "I figured you haven't had dinner," he said, setting. She gently placed the bag down. "I usually don't eat after 9 p.m., she said, a faint smile gracing her lips. "But I'm guessing you're the kind of guy who can't sleep without whipping something up first," I remarked. Nathan looked at her, a flicker of surprise dancing in his eyes before a soft laugh escaped him. "You're pretty observant. I've had this habit ever since I was a kid. When I cook, I feel a sense of peace wash over me," he admitted. He then proceeded to take out a few strands of spaghetti, a wedge of pecorino cheese, black pepper, and a knob of butter. "Cacio e pepe," he announced. "Simple, quick, and it always hits the spot." The aroma of melting butter began to permeate the kitchen, mingling with the subtle spice of toasted pepper, enveloping the quiet space in a warmth that felt almost nostalgic. Emily leaned against the counter, resting her chin in her hand, watching him move with practiced ease and effortless grace. "Where did you learn to cook?" she inquired. Nathan didn't look up from his task. His voice was steady and calm as he replied, "My grandmother taught me everything I know. She used to run a small trattoria in Italy. When I was little, she'd always say, 'Cooking is how you love without words.' I used to laugh it off back then, thinking she was just being sentimental. Now I get it. The woman was wise." He plated the pasta and placed it in front of her, sprinkling a light dusting of cheese on top, before sliding it across the counter. "Try it." Emily twirled a forkful of pasta, savoring the aroma of pepper intermingling with the rich cheese and the warmth of the butter. Her senses came alive with each bite. "It's wonderful," she said softly. With a quiet certainty, Nathan sat down across from her, the warm light casting a gentle glow over the sharp angles of his face. "I've always thought that cooking and rebuilding people aren't all that different," he mused. "Both take patience, intuition, and a bit of courage to start over. To start over. Is that what you're doing then?" Emily asked, lifting her gaze to meet his. Nathan paused for a moment before nodding. "I've spent half my life running away from the Mela name, but I've come to realize that unless I face it head-on, I'll never truly be free," he said, his voice growing quieter. "My mother passed away without ever knowing I'd left that darkness behind. I want Verona House to be a place she could be proud of, even if it's only in memory." Emily gently placed her fork down, a tightening sensation in her chest. "Do you think she'd forgive you?" she asked softly. Nathan met her eyes, his gaze warmer than she had ever seen it before. "I honestly don't know, but maybe she'd understand. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about believing that people are capable of change." In that moment, the space between them no longer felt like that of an employer and an employee, or even two wounded souls trying to put their lives back together. It was simply two souls adrift in the same quiet space, both searching for a way to escape the shadows of the past. Emily offered a faint smile. "You sound like someone who studied philosophy," she said. Nathan answered, half serious, half amused. "Maybe I've just lost enough to know that money can't buy peace." Silence settled between them once again, gentle and unforced. The only sounds that broke the stillness were the soft clinking of silverware and the gentle sigh of the wind rustling through the trees outside. As the clock struck 11, Emily rose to leave. "Thank you for dinner," she said, reaching for her coat. "And thank you for not just seeing me as the woman who spilled the wine." Nathan smiled, his eyes conveying something unspoken. "I see you for who you truly are. You don't have to be perfect to have worth." As she turned to go, her heart skipped a beat. Outside, snow drifted down in small golden flakes beneath the glow of the streetlights as Emily stepped out the door. She glanced back to see Nathan still standing in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, his gaze lost in the rising steam from the pot. The scene was strangely peaceful, as if time itself had slowed down to breathe. And in that moment, Emily realized that perhaps it wasn't just Verona House that was being rebuilt. Perhaps she was too. After years of fear and quiet endurance, she felt hope was being rekindled piece by something as simple and human as a bowl of pasta shared in the warmth of the night. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the glass walls of Verona House, glinting off the polished stainless steel counters. The air was filled with a palpable energy. New staff members were testing out appetizer recipes, while Emily stood in the middle of the kitchen, notebook in hand, her eyes focused on a simmering pan. She had grown accustomed to leading the team, though she still preferred to work alongside everyone rather than simply observe from afar. Nathan Mela walked in, sleeves rolled up, his tie draped casually over one shoulder. He smiled at the sight of her teaching one of the cooks how to properly season a sauce. "You don't have to do everything yourself, you know," he said, his tone a mix of sternness and affection. Emily turned around, a few strands of hair sticking to her temple. I can't tell someone they're doing it right if I haven't done it myself. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful, as if something unspoken crossed his mind. Then he stepped closer, resting his hand on the edge of the counter, watching her stir. Careful, he said quietly. The sauce is boiling too vigorously. No sooner had he spoken than a droplet of oil popped up from the pan, landing on the back of her hand. Emily flinched, dropping the spoon with a metallic clang. She winced, pulling her hand back instinctively. Let me see, Nathan said quickly, catching her wrist before she could protest. The burn glowed red against her pale skin. He guided her toward the sink, turned on the cold water, and held her hand under the stream. The shock of the chill made her shiver, but his voice was low and steady, almost soothing. Breathe slowly. It's all right. She looked down at her hand resting in his, the warmth of his palm against her skin both unfamiliar and safe. No one in the kitchen dared to speak. The only sounds were the hiss of the water and the pounding of her own heartbeat. When the burn began to fade, Nathan gently patted her hand dry with a paper towel, then opened a cabinet and retrieved a small first aid kit. I always keep one here, he said with a quiet grin. Cooking can be a dangerous sport. He applied a thin layer of ointment, his touch careful and deliberate, as though he were handling something incredibly fragile. From this close, Emily could see a faint scar curving along his left cheek, something she had never noticed before. You've been burned before? She asked softly. He nodded, still focused on her hand. When I was 16, I tried to cook for my mother and accidentally turned the flame up too high. I ended up burning my entire left arm. She just laughed and said, at least the meal was made with love. The story caused a pang in her chest. There was something in his voice, not pain, but longing. When he finished wrapping her hand, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. She could smell the faint scent of sandalwood on his skin, and hear the calm rhythm of his breathing in the quiet space between them. Nathan was the first to break the moment. His tone was soft but firm. Next time, let me handle that. I'm used to getting burned. A faint smile touched her lips. If you do everything, I'll never learn. He looked at her with a mix of surrender and admiration. You're stubborn. I just don't want to be seen as weak, she said, her voice gentle but sure. I've spent my whole life standing up every time someone tried to push me down. He didn't answer, but his eyes spoke volumes, filled with an understanding that words couldn't quite capture. Then he said quietly, from now on, you don't have to do that alone. Later that afternoon, when the others had gone home, Emily looked at the bandage on her hand, tracing its cool edge with a smile. She didn't quite understand why the burn made her feel warm inside. Perhaps it was because for the first time in a long while, someone had cared not out of duty, but out of genuine concern. Meanwhile, upstairs in his office, Nathan stood by the window, watching her step out into the golden haze of evening, her hair catching the wind. His hand still remembered the feel of her skin, and deep inside him, a quiet flame had begun to burn. It wasn't fierce and consuming like the flames of the past, but gentle, the kind of light that makes a man want to linger just a little longer, simply to know he is still capable of feeling alive. 2 weeks later, Emily Carter stepped out of the black SUV parked in front of O'Hare Airport, pulling a small suitcase behind her. Nathan Mela was already waiting outside the International Departures Terminal, dressed in a white shirt beneath a long gray coat. Dark sunglasses shielded his eyes, and his demeanor was calm yet unreadable. He tilted his head in greeting, a faint smile crossing his face like a quiet reassurance. Ready for your first trip as Verona House's consultant? Emily pressed her lips together, trying to hide her nervousness. I still can't believe I'm flying to Italy. I've never been outside the US before. Nathan nodded slightly, his voice lowering as if he were recalling a distant memory. Siena was where I first learned that not every great meal needs expensive ingredients. Some things only need sincerity. The line made her smile softly, easing the wave of anxiety that always seemed to accompany her at airports. On the plane, after the seatbelt light dimmed, Nathan opened his laptop to review reports while Emily gazed out the window, watching the vast ocean stretch endlessly below amid the steady hum of the engines. Her thoughts drifted back to the moment his hand had wrapped around hers when he bandaged her burn. The way he'd said she didn't have to be alone anymore. That memory, fragile yet warm, kept returning to her whenever she closed her eyes. When the plane landed in Florence, the morning light bathed Italy in a soft, golden glow. They continued by car to Siena, the road winding through olive groves and vineyards that spread across rolling hills. Emily leaned her head against the window, watching the red-tiled rooftops shimmer through a veil of mist. Nathan drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on his knee. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one that felt natural, steady, and unspoken. When they reached the heart of Siena, the air was filled with the scent of coffee, toasted bread, and the distant toll of church bells. Nathan led her to a small restaurant tucked away in an old alley where his old friend Marco, a warm-faced Italian chef in his 50s, was already waiting. "You really can't live without a kitchen, can you?" Marco laughed, pulling Nathan into a warm embrace. They spoke in Italian, the easy rhythm of two men who had shared a lifetime of stories. Nathan introduced Emily, explaining that she was the one who had helped him bring Verona House back to life. Marco shook her hand with genuine warmth. "If Nathan trusts you, then you must be someone special." Emily blushed, unsure how to respond. Throughout lunch, Nathan had her taste Tuscany's signature dishes: peach al tartufo, homemade pasta rich with truffle, and a glass of Chianti wine that glowed ruby red in the afternoon light. He told her about his childhood visits to Italy when his mother had brought him there to escape his father's world. She used to say that if you want to understand people, watch how they eat. "Happy people always eat slowly," he said, gazing out the window where sunlight gilded the cobblestone streets. Emily listened quietly, feeling a mix of admiration and closeness rise within her. For the first time, she wasn't seeing him as the poised businessman who carried his father's shadow, but as a man who had once been lost and was still searching for a piece of himself that had been denied for far too long. That evening, they walked through Piazza del Campo, the square glowing under strings of lanterns. Music drifted softly from a nearby cafe, blending with the murmur of laughter and the chatter of strangers. When they stopped near the old fountain, a gentle breeze swept through the air, and Nathan said quietly, "Thank you for not walking away from my world." Emily's heart tightened. "I don't think I'm in your world," she replied. "I'm just trying to do my job." He smiled, but it was a smile laced with sadness. "Maybe, but whether you realize it or not, your presence makes that world a lot less dark." His words left her speechless. The wind stirred her hair, and though he didn't touch her, he stood close enough for her to feel his warmth. Together, they looked up at the Italian night sky, vast and full of stars. And in that still moment, Emily understood that something had shifted between them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet pulse of two hearts, learning, little by little, how to believe in something beautiful again. The Tuscan sky was awash of amber that afternoon, and the sun sank slowly behind the olive-covered hills, painting the horizon in ribbons of gold and orange. Nathan Mela and Emily Carter were in the countryside outside Siena, where Marco had invited them to visit his family's small vineyard. They walked along a gravel path lined with rows of heavy grapevines, the air rich with the scent of dry grass and warm earth. Nathan walked a few steps ahead, speaking about how he wanted to bring this particular grape variety back to the U.S., hoping to create Verona House's own line of wine. Emily listened, smiling faintly, noticing how the fading light brushed over his hair, softening everything around them into a living painting. When they stopped amid a grove of ancient olive trees, Nathan set down the wicker basket he was carrying, poured 2 glasses of red wine, and handed one to her. "I once promised my mother," he said slowly, his voice roughened by the wind, "that I would only reopen Verona House when I found someone who could bring it back to life, not with money, but with soul." Emily looked at him, the sunset reflecting in his gray eyes, making them gleam with a light she hadn't seen before. "And you think I'm that person?" she asked quietly. Nathan didn't answer right away. He took a sip of wine, then said, "I don't know, but ever since you walked in, I haven't seen Verona House as just a project anymore. It's become something else, a way to mend things, to believe that people can start over." She fell silent, her heart beating faster. The amber light spread softly over everything, blurring the line between distance and closeness. A breeze swept past, lifting a few strands of hair from her forehead. Nathan reached up instinctively, brushing them gently behind her ear, his hand lingering for a moment, hesitant, almost afraid of its own movement. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. No words were spoken, but the silence between them carried more meaning than speech ever could. She could feel his breath and the faint scent of wine and wood on him. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but the wind and the pounding rhythm of her heart. When Nathan leaned in, the space between them dissolved. The kiss came softly, like an exhale. Not rushed, not possessive, but a quiet acknowledgement between two souls who had both been guarded for far too long. In that instant, Emily felt her fears and old shadows begin to fade. Nathan's hand tightened gently around hers as the last light of day wrapped around them, bearing silent witness to two wounded people finding faith again in each other. When they finally drew apart, Emily smiled faintly, her voice trembling slightly. "We just crossed a professional line." Nathan laughed, the rare kind of laugh that made him look younger, almost unburdened. "Maybe, but sometimes boundaries are just things people build because they're afraid of what's real." She looked at him, her eyes uncertain yet tender. "Aren't you afraid?" He answered softly, his voice like wind through the olive leaves. "I've lived my whole life afraid. Now there's only one thing that scares me. Losing the person who made me believe kindness still exists." Emily lowered her gaze, afraid that if she looked at him any longer, her heart would never find its way back to safety. The sun had slipped completely beyond the hills, leaving behind a lavender glow that stretched across the fields. They sat down beneath an ancient olive tree, its leaves whispering in the evening wind, and watched the first stars appear in the Italian sky. Nathan set his glass aside and said quietly, "If there's a next life, I hope my mother can see this moment." Emily looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe she already can. Maybe she sees that her son has finally found peace. In that quiet space, words became unnecessary. Only the lingering light of dusk and the warmth between them remained, fragile yet infinite. And as the wind drifted through the olive branches, Emily knew that even when she returned to Chicago, no matter what awaited them, this moment would stay with her. The evening when, for the first time in years, her heart dared to beat for someone else. The next morning, their flight from Florence touched down in Chicago beneath a thin veil of early winter snow. Emily Carter sat quietly in the car, watching through the fogged window as the city came into view. Tall buildings, hurried crowds, the blare of car horns. Everything seemed to pull her back into reality after the impossibly peaceful days in Siena. Beside her, Nathan Mela scrolled through his work schedule, the light from the tablet reflecting against his cheek, bringing back the familiar look of restraint and focus. She realized that the man who had shared stories about his grandmother beneath the Tuscan sunset now wore the expression of someone who had long since learned to hide what he truly felt. When the car stopped in front of Verona House, the new sign shimmered under the pale morning light. Workers were mounting a second line beneath it. A taste of dignity. Emily stepped out, drawing a deep breath. She could still smell traces of Italian wine and wind in her hair, but Chicago carried a different scent, one of reality, of challenge, of unfinished business. Nathan turned toward her, his voice low and steady. "Thank you for the trip. I didn't think I could ever return there and feel at peace." She smiled faintly, her gaze resting on the light dusting of snow on his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd miss Italy this much." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded slightly, that familiar gesture of a man accustomed to keeping his words carefully guarded. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the rhythm of reopening. Old and new staff members moved around, setting tables, polishing glasses, adjusting lights. Emily tied on her apron and slipped easily into the flow of work, as though she had never left. Yet, every time she passed Nathan, Her heart tightened a little, as if something between them still lingered, undefined. By late afternoon, the management meeting convened upstairs. Nathan outlined plans for expanding the brand while Emily took notes, occasionally offering insights about customer experience. When the meeting ended and everyone else had filed out, only the two of them remained. Sunlight poured through the window, washing the room in the same soft amber that had filled the air in Siena. Nathan leaned against the desk, silent for a while, then asked quietly, "Do you think we made a mistake?" Emily paused mid-sentence, her pen frozen in her hand. "If you mean that kiss." He nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window. "I don't regret it. I just don't want it to make things harder for you." She set the pen down, her voice calm, though it trembled ever so faintly. "There's nothing hard about it. I just don't want it to overshadow what we're building here." He turned to face her. In his gray eyes was something she couldn't quite name, admiration, maybe, or a quiet ache. "You're always so strong." "I have to be," she said with a small, tired smile. "Otherwise, I would have fallen apart a long time ago." Silence settled between them once again, the clock ticking steadily. Outside, snow began to fall in slow spirals. Nathan moved closer, stopping just before her desk. His tone was warm, firm, and unmistakably sincere. "I promise you that everything between us will stay confidential. I don't want you to be seen differently, not by our staff, not by the press. I'll protect you, the way I wish someone had protected my mother." The words caught in her throat, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she knew he meant every single one of them. The man standing before her wasn't speaking from pity. He understood with painful clarity the worth of someone who had once had to rise from humiliation. When Emily stepped out of the office, the Chicago sky was thick with white mist. The lights from Verona House spilled softly through the windows, golden and calm. She stopped for a moment, looking up at the sign behind her. Nathan still stood inside, watching silently. In that instant, both of them knew that no matter how much they tried to keep things professional, what lay between them had already slipped beyond their control. It was no longer gratitude, nor simple respect. It was something deeper, quieter. A flame smoldering beneath the ash, waiting for the faintest breath of wind to spark it back to life. 1 week after their return, the city lay wrapped in a cold mist, and the yellow lights shimmered on the wet streets. Emily Carter was on her way to Verona House when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic. "Ms. Emily, the restaurant. Something's happened. Fire. Smoke. We've called the fire department." She went numb for a heartbeat, then ran, her heart hammering so hard she felt like she might pass out. And when her car finally pulled up, she could hardly believe the sight before her. Verona House was shrouded in smoke, firefighters battling embers that still leaped from the back kitchen. Staff members huddled at the curb, many of them weeping, some coughing from the smoke. She pushed through the crowd, calling his name until she saw him emerge from inside. His shirt streaked with soot, hair disordered, his face set in a stern line within the gray haze. And she breathed out in relief, seizing his hand with a slight tremor. "Are you all right?" Nathan only nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. And then he said, "Luckily, no one is badly hurt, but this wasn't an accident." The words froze her. "What do you mean?" she asked, and he glanced toward the storage area where the fire had begun. The electrical system was checked just last week. Couldn't have started by itself. Someone set it on fire. A cold dread washed over her. A shiver ran down her spine as she looked at that place. And as police began to cordon off the scene, Nathan grew quiet, his eyes darkening as if a ghost from the past had materialized before him. They sat in the car for several hours after the blaze was extinguished. He remained silent, staring at his hands, still smudged with ash, until finally he spoke in a hoarse voice thick with smoke and fatigue. "I know who did this." Emily turned to him, alarmed. "Who?" "Anthony Russo." The name landed like a blow, shattering the fragile calm they had managed to build. She vaguely recalled hearing the name before, a former rival of the Mel family who had ventured into restaurant investments. "Are you sure?" she asked. Nathan nodded slowly. Russo said I would pay for daring to cleanse the Mel name through legal means. He lost numerous contracts when Verona House reopened. I wounded his pride. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, his voice dropping to a whisper. I have tried to leave the darkness, Emily. But it seems the darkness never leaves me. She looked at him, her chest tightening. Even with ash smudged on his face, she clearly saw that his eyes were not full of fear, but heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had spent his life walking the blurry line between right and wrong. You are not the man you used to be, she said softly. You are not them. He opened his eyes and looked at her for a long moment. Maybe, but they still treat me as if I am. And if I do nothing now, they'll burn again. Not only the restaurant, but the people inside it. Emily gripped his hand, her voice steady and resolute. Then we fight together, not with violence, but with truth. I've seen Verona House rebuilt. I will not let it fall because of your past. Nathan let out a tired smile that was painful to hear. You always speak as if you believe the world is fair. No, she replied, meeting his gaze. I simply believe that if no one starts with kindness, then no one else will. Outside, smoke continued to rise from the blackened bricks. The flashing lights of the fire engines cast shifting pools of illumination across their faces, much like the chiaroscuro of Nathan's life. And in that moment, Emily understood that this was not merely arson, but the opening salvo in a battle, not fought with guns or blood, but with honor, memory, and truth, a fight they would have to face, even if it meant risking the fragile connection they had just discovered on a quiet Tuscan evening. In the days following the fire, the atmosphere around Verona House grew oppressive. The walls remained stained black, and the scent of smoke clung to the corridors, no matter how many times they were cleaned. Emily Carter sat in a small meeting room, a stack of financial documents and insurance reports spread out before her. Nathan Mel entered, his face a mask of grim determination. He had just returned from a meeting with the attorneys. They won't cover the full claim, he said hoarsely. They're suggesting it was an intentional act from within. Emily looked up, startled. You mean they're accusing us? Nathan gave a slight nod. Someone staged this to make it look like I was behind it. He sat across from her, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Russo doesn't just want to destroy property. He wants to destroy my name. He wants to destroy me. Emily said nothing for a moment, feeling the suppressed anger simmering in his voice. Then she spoke softly. We can fight back legally. If he uses the media, we'll use the media. Nathan's gaze softened slightly. You're starting to think like someone on the inside. That's because I am, she said firmly. Since joining Verona House, she was no longer the timid waitress from the old wine bar. She understood now that she stood in the middle of a war for dignity, where silence meant surrender. They began gathering evidence, from security footage to invoices, employee records, even strange emails that had arrived in the company inbox in recent weeks. Nathan worked with his private attorney, an older man who had once been a friend of his father, but had chosen a lawful path. Emily oversaw the communications team, rewriting the entire press statement. We won't issue an apology, she told the group. We'll speak of rebirth, how Verona House was built not just with money, but with trust. That's something no one can take away. The room fell silent. Then Nathan nodded slowly, deliberately. You're right. Absolutely right. In the days that followed, he worked relentlessly, his phone constantly buzzing. He spoke with investors, journalists, and the police. The city lights reflected through the glass each night, painting his face with the visage of a man waging a silent battle. Sometimes Emily found him standing alone in the kitchen, a glass of wine in his hand, staring into the void. What are you afraid of? She asked. Nathan didn't turn around. Of becoming him. The more I fight the darkness, the closer I feel to it. She stepped nearer, her voice quiet but firm. No one becomes their enemy just because they fight. You're not using violence. You're using reason. That's the difference. He turned then, the gray in his eyes shimmering with a mixture of pride and fear. Do you trust me, Emily? If I didn't, I would have left the night of the fire. The words silenced him for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly, as if he had just found something to hold on to in the storm. When the court opened its preliminary hearing, Nathan appeared in a dark gray suit, composed in a way that felt almost unnatural. Emily sat in the back row, her chest tight as she spotted Anthony Russo across the room. His faint smile laced with provocation. Cameras flashed, and the press whispered. When the opposing lawyer began his attack, implying that Nathan had used illicit funds to rebuild his brand, Nathan stayed calm, speaking only when necessary, each word measured and cold. When the session ended, he stepped out of the courtroom, the top button of his shirt undone, looking as though he had just emerged from a grueling trench warfare. Emily approached quietly. "Are you all right?" He looked at her, a hint of a weary smile crossing his face. "Far from over," he said, but his eyes were brighter than ever. "But at least this time, I'm not fighting alone." Emily gave his hand a brief squeeze. Above Chicago, the smoke from distant factories drifted into the sky like the lingering remnants of an old war that had never truly ended. And in Nathan's eyes, she saw the light of a man who had chosen to confront rather than flee, not with guns, not with power, but with the quiet strength of endurance, the kind of strength only those who have known darkness can ever truly understand. 3 months after the fire, Verona House reopened its doors. That night, Chicago glittered beneath the city lights. White ribbons were tied along the balcony rails. Red roses spilled across every table, and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the air. Emily Carter stood before the mirror in the back room, dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair pulled into a high bun. A woman utterly transformed from the trembling waitress who once carried trays of wine with shaking hands. She looked at her reflection, smiled faintly, then stepped downstairs. Nathan Mell stood on a small platform, shaking hands with investors and journalists, his black suit impeccably tailored, his deep, steady voice rising above the jazz music. "Tonight," he said, "Verona House is not just a restaurant. It is proof that trust can rise again from ashes. We're back." The room erupted in applause. Camera flashes flickered like sparks. Emily stood at the back, watching him, seeing in him a steadiness she had never witnessed before. Nathan was no longer the man haunted by the past, but one who had turned his pain into purpose. When his gaze met hers across the crowd, a single, quiet nod passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement that they had weathered the storm and were still standing. Guests sampled the new menu she and the team had created. Smoked salmon with lemon for starters, and the signature Casio e Pepe Nathan had cooked for her on that late night long ago. Compliments flowed. A few guests even grew emotional when Emily gave her short speech. "Verona House was rebuilt not to prove anything," she said, "but to remind us that people can change and that kindness, when planted in the right soil, will grow even from scorched ground." The room fell silent for a moment before applause swelled again. Nathan looked at her, pride glinting in his eyes, but beneath it, something deeper, more personal. The piece didn't last long. As the evening drew to a close, Emily was directing the servers when a chill ran down her spine. She looked up and saw Anthony Russo step through the door. His tailored suit gleamed under the lights, his half-smile arrogant and venomous. He walked toward the bar as if the celebration were his own. Nathan saw him, too. Neither spoke, but the air tightened like a drawn bowstring. Russo raised his glass, his voice slicing through the music. "Well, Mel, congratulations," he said, dripping with sarcasm. "It's really something to see you rise so quickly. Perhaps arson is the finest form of marketing." A few reporters turned their heads, cameras already raised. Emily stepped forward, her tone sharp as glass. "Mr. Russo, tonight isn't for insults. This is a place of respect." He chuckled smoothly. "Respect from a waitress who was once fired for spilling wine? The world certainly has a way of handing out miracles." Nathan stepped up beside her, his gaze cold steel, his voice low but carrying. She stood back up on her own. "What about you? Did you have to burn down a building to feel seen?" Silence fell over the room. Russo's jaw tightened, fury flashing briefly in his eyes before he forced a smile. "We'll meet again, Mel. I've never lost on my own turf. Remember that." He set his glass down and walked out, leaving behind the heavy scent of cologne and a hollow chill in his wake. Nathan stood still for a few seconds, then turned to Emily and murmured, "He didn't come to ruin the night. He came to warn us." "Then we won't be afraid," she replied, her voice calm but unyielding. He looked at her, weariness etched on his face, but admiration glowing beneath it. Outside, winter winds whipped against the glass, sending the white ribbons fluttering loose. Inside, under the warm lights, surrounded by laughter and music, Nathan and Emily stood side by side. Silent, united, they both knew this night was not just a reopening. It was the beginning of another confrontation, one where light would have to cut through the darkness once more to prove that the Real flame could never be extinguished. 2 days after the reopening, Chicago lay under a thick veil of fog, its streets eerily still. Inside the Verona House office, dim light illuminated a whiteboard covered with notes, arrows, and tangled diagrams. Emily Carter stood by the desk, watching Nathan Mell write the final lines on a thick folder. "Everything's ready," he said, his tone calm to the point of menace. "Russo thinks he's the one setting the trap, but in truth he's already walked into his own." Emily stepped closer, her eyes serious. "Are you sure the evidence is strong enough?" Nathan nodded. "He wasn't careful when he set fire to Verona House. He hired a transportation company that's already under investigation for money laundering. I sent that information to the FBI. They've been watching him for over a month. Tonight they'll make their move." She looked at him, admiration and unease tangled in her chest. "You planned this from the beginning?" He didn't look up from the folder. "From the night of the fire, I knew he wouldn't stop. I needed him to believe I was still reacting, not acting. What I learned from my father is this: sometimes, to defeat a devil, you have to let him think he's winning." Emily fell silent, all warring with fear. He could be so cold, so precise. And yet, that same control was what had kept him alive in a world where every decision carried a price. That evening, Verona House opened as usual. The dining room buzzed with life, the kitchen moved in perfect synchronicity, and the scent of rosemary and butter filled the air. No one knew that just 2 blocks away, several unmarked black cars were parked, their plainclothes agents awaiting a signal. Emily stood behind the bar, trying to steady her breathing. When Russo walked in, he came alone, smug and polished, and took a seat by the window, the very table where Nathan had once defended her on that fateful night. Nathan appeared moments later, holding a glass of wine, a calm smile playing on his lips. "I assume you're here to celebrate?" Russo looked up, contempt flashing in his eyes. "No, I came to remind you that this game isn't over. You can buy the press, buy the lawyers, but you'll never wash the Mell name clean." Nathan sat opposite him, his voice low and steady. "You're wrong. I'm not trying to wash it. I'm trying to use it differently." Russo gave a slow, mocking grin, turning a Mafia legacy into a humanitarian brand. "Clever, but you're still just a son of a sinner." Nathan tilted his head, his gaze turning to steel. "Maybe, but at least I don't burn down other people's restaurants out of envy." Russo's laugh was short and brittle, and it died the moment Nathan placed his phone on the table. The screen lit up, and a recording played, his own voice unmistakable. "Make sure the fire starts from the storage room. I don't want anyone walking out if they're on the night shift." Russo's face drained of color. He moved to stand, but the restaurant doors burst open. 2 FBI agents stepped in, flashing their badges. "Anthony Russo," one said, "you're under arrest for arson, endangering civilian lives, and interstate money laundering." The entire dining room froze. Russo struggled, shouting protests, but Nathan remained seated, silent, his eyes as calm as still water as the agents led him past. Russo turned, his teeth bared. "You think you've won, Mel? You've just become a more polished version of your father." Nathan said nothing, his jaw tightening as Russo was dragged out into the fog. From across the room, Emily saw his hand gripping the wine glass so hard his knuckles turned white. When the chaos subsided, she approached, her voice soft. "You did the right thing. You didn't take revenge. You protected what was worth protecting." He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the doorway. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I've just killed the last piece of who I used to be. She laid a gentle hand over his, her gaze steady and tender. You didn't kill it. You just stopped letting it rule you. Nathan turned to her then, fatigue etched deep in his face, but in his eyes, a faint, fragile light. If it weren't for you, I might not have stopped in time. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes covering what little blackened ruin the city still bore. Inside Verona House, jazz played again, low and warm, threading through the mellow light that shimmered on the tables. Emily knew that though this battle was over, the scars inside Nathan would remain. But at least this time, he was no longer standing in the dark alone. That night, Verona House closed early. The snowstorm had passed, leaving behind a city wrapped in silence. Emily Carter stood in the kitchen, watching the small flame of a half-burned candle flicker on the table. Wisps of smoke curled upward, seemingly slowing time itself. Nathan Mell stepped in, his coat still dusted with snow. He stood in silence for a long while. Then, quietly, he said, I just came back from the FBI office. Russo confessed. He'll be facing many years in prison. Emily nodded, her eyes calm yet deep. Then it's over. He looked at her, the gray in his eyes restless, unsettled. No, Emily, for me it's just beginning. He moved closer, sitting across from her. The candlelight fell across his face, tracing the hard, weary lines of a man who had carried too much. I used to believe that staying away from my father's shadow would make me different, he said. But today, watching Russo in handcuffs, I trembled. Not out of pity, but out of fear, because in his eyes, I saw something I recognized, a piece of myself I've spent years denying. Emily stayed silent, listening, every word seeming heavier than air. You chose differently, she said softly. You didn't let hatred decide what you did. Nathan gave a faint, bitter smile. Do you know what the cruelest part is? I defeated Russo using the very lessons I learned from my father, how to gather evidence, set a trap, make the enemy step into it on his own. My mother used to say I was more like him than I wanted to admit. And now, maybe she was right. Emily rose, stepping toward him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Nathan, you're not him, she said gently. You took what once caused harm and turned it into protection. That's the difference between cruelty and courage. He looked up at her, his eyes holding gratitude, guilt, and something else, something he'd never dared to name. I don't know what kept me from falling deeper into the dark, he murmured. But maybe it was you. Emily trembled. Her heart raced as if each beat were an answer she couldn't yet speak aloud. I only did what anyone who cares for you would do, she whispered, but Nathan shook his head. No, no one's ever looked at me the way you do. No one's ever believed I could be good. Not even me. He stood, and the space between them vanished in a breath. The air in the kitchen thickened, filled only by the faint hiss of wind against the window and the soft crackle of the candle. Emily met his gaze, her voice trembling. You don't need to prove anything anymore. You already have. Nathan stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek, hesitant, but filled with all the words he couldn't say. I'm not afraid of judgment anymore, he whispered. I'm only afraid of losing the one person who makes me believe I can still be forgiven. A tear rolled down Emily's cheek, not of weakness, but of everything they had endured, converging into this quiet moment. She took his hand, pressing it gently. You've already been forgiven, Nathan, not by me, but by the part of yourself you chose to keep. He leaned down, and their kiss came slow and tender, not born of desire, but of release. The candle before them wavered, its light trembling against the wall, where two shadows merged into one. No words left, only warmth and breath in unison. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the last traces of the fire that once scarred the building. And in Emily's heart, she knew every wound could heal, if someone dared to touch it without fear of being burned. That night in that kitchen, between the faint scent of smoke and the fragile light of a single flame, she knew at last that both of them had found what they had never dared to name peace. 1 year after that night, Chicago welcomed its first spring without an early snow. Morning sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows of Verona House, now reborn under a new name, Taste of Fire. The words had been chosen by Nathan Mell himself, inspired by something Emily Carter once said, a sentence that had never left him. Fire can burn, but it can also forge. She stood by the doorway, dressed in the new uniform, a deep wine-red shade that matched the restaurant's new logo, her eyes following the staff as they arranged flowers and polished silver. Light glinted off the thin silver ring on her fourth finger. Nathan walked over, a folded morning paper in his hand, a faint smile brushing his lips. The press is calling this a symbol of rebirth in the heart of Chicago, he said, placing the newspaper on the counter. But all I see is a place that reminds people that sometimes pain has its own sweetness. That's important, Emily smiled, her gaze soft yet radiant with quiet pride. Taste of Fire isn't just a restaurant, Nathan. It's your story, our story. She stepped closer, straightening his collar gently. Do you remember the first day I came here? I was a waitress, humiliated in front of everyone. And you were a man running from his own name. Nathan chuckled, his voice low and warm like aged wine. And now you're running the entire Taste of Fire network across 3 states. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to figure out how to cook eggs without burning them. She laughed, a bright, honest sound that filled the sunlit air like a note of music. From outside came the sound of footsteps, the young interns arriving for their shift, their faces fresh with excitement and hope. Emily watched them, her heart swelling with warmth. Many of them had once been unemployed, rejected, convinced they had no more chances left. Now, they worked in a place praised not only for its cuisine but for its philosophy. We don't rebuild reputations. We rebuild people. When the press arrived to film a feature segment, Emily stood before the camera. Her voice was calm, deliberate, every word drawn from lived experience. Taste of Fire doesn't teach people to cook for success, she said, but to rediscover themselves. The kitchen isn't just a place where meals are made. It's where people are healed. Through every burn, every drop of sweat. The audience outside applauded from a distance. Nathan watched, his eyes softening, a quiet pride curving his lips. He no longer felt the need to hide the name Mel. He had learned to make it a legacy not of sin, but of redemption. That evening, when the restaurant closed, Nathan and Emily sat together at the last table, the sunset slanting through the glass. On the table were 2 glasses of red wine, fragrant with a trace of smoke. I still remember the Casio e Pepe from that first night, she said quietly. Tasted like a beginning. Nathan took a sip of wine, his gaze drifting to the slow traffic outside. And this glass, he replied, tastes like something that's passed but never really gone. Emily said nothing for. After a while, she gently placed her hand over his. You know, she murmured softly, I used to think fire could only hurt you, but now I know it can also keep you warm, if you know how to hold it. Nathan looked at her, his fingers closing firmly around hers. You taught me that, Emily. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the last light of day touched the Taste of Fire sign, reflecting a faint glow, like a flame that refused to die out. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, This fire, it finally became light, hasn't it? And in that moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to their hearts beat in time with the rhythm of the city, a wordless symphony of healing, where fire no longer burned with pain, but lingered instead as the gentle warmth of trust, compassion, and a love found amidst the ashes of their past. On an early summer morning, sunlight streamed diagonally through the wide glass panes of Verona House, now proudly known as Taste of Fire. The air inside was quiet, filled with the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. Emily Carter carefully adjusted the collar of her crisp white shirt, standing before the mirror in the waiting room, taking a deep, calming breath. Today was her first live television interview since Taste of Fire had been honored as Social Recovery Enterprise of the Year. Nathan Mell entered, holding a steaming cup of black coffee, a soft, genuine smile curving his lips. Ready? He asked, his tone light but warm, full of reassurance. She turned to him and smiled, a little nervously. I prepared all night, she admitted. But I'm still a little nervous. Nathan handed her the cup, his eyes gentle and understanding. Don't think of it as an interview, he suggested. Just think of it as telling our story. His words made her smile again, calmer this time, but touched with emotion. When the cameras turned on, the host greeted the viewers with enthusiasm and then turned to Emily. Emily Carter, she said warmly. Many people say that Taste of Fire isn't just a restaurant. It's a miracle right here in the heart of Chicago. Could you tell us what inspired its unique philosophy? Emily sat up straight, her voice soft but firm, filled with quiet strength. We didn't build this restaurant to impress anyone, she explained. We built it to heal. Here, we don't rebuild reputations, we rebuild people. The host tilted her head, genuine curiosity flickering in her eyes. Rebuild people? She asked, intrigued. Could you explain what that means? Emily smiled, her eyes shining with quiet conviction. Many who come to Taste of Fire aren't looking to start a career, she said. They're looking to start over. I was once one of them. I know what it feels like to be looked down upon, to be treated as if you don't deserve respect. But someone believed in me when the world turned its back. And that belief changed everything. Her voice frayed slightly as she spoke, the emotion clear. Nathan stood in the distance, leaning against a wooden pillar, silent, watching her with pride and deep affection. No one watching knew that he was the man she spoke of, the one who had once stood up for a humiliated waitress before a room full of strangers, risking his own reputation. The host continued, her voice soft but full of admiration. I've heard that you came up with the name Taste of Fire yourself, she said. What does it mean? Emily glanced toward the window, where sunlight reflected off the polished silver sign outside. Fire can destroy, but it can also warm, she explained. It's a symbol of pain and rebirth. To me, every person can be a flame, even if it's been extinguished. Can burn again if someone believes. The studio fell silent for a few moments, everyone absorbing the weight of her words. Then, the host smiled and nodded in understanding. What a beautiful thought, she said sincerely. You've shown that kindness might vanish into darkness, but it never truly dies. When the program ended and the crew began to pack up, Emily remained standing alone in the room, lost in her thoughts. Nathan approached, wearing a rare smile, not bright or showy, but quiet and real, a genuine expression of pride. You just made all of Chicago stop for a few minutes to listen, he said softly, his voice full of emotion. You spoke for me, for my mother, and for everyone who ever thought they didn't deserve a second chance. Emily turned to him, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. I just said what I believe, she said simply. Nathan was silent for a moment, then replied gently, and that's exactly why I believe in you. Outside, the streets of Chicago bustled with life. A few passers-by paused in front of the restaurant, reading the words etched beneath its sign. We don't rebuild reputations. We rebuild people. Through the window, Emily watched them, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She knew that in a world where trust was often fragile and hard-won, they had built something rare and precious. A place where people were seen, forgiven, and given a chance to begin again. And there, the fire within them no longer burned out of anger, resentment, or despair, but out of love, compassion, and hope, a steady flame born of faith, showing that even the most broken hearts can still glow like warm and bright embers long after the initial fire has passed. That night after the interview aired, Taste of Fire was busier than ever before. It seemed like the whole city wanted to flock there, wanting to breathe the air of a story that had just spread across the entire country. Emily Carter was directing the kitchen staff with her usual calm efficiency when Nathan Mell walked in, his phone in hand. He had just received hundreds of messages. Congratulatory notes, partnership offers, and heartfelt thank you emails from people who had once made mistakes and now longed for a second chance, a fresh start. We did it, he said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Taste of Fire isn't just a restaurant anymore, Emily. It's become a symbol, She turned to him, her smile lighting her face more brightly than the kitchen lamps ever could. "I just hope people understand that not every miracle begins with light," she said softly. "Sometimes it begins with fire." Nathan nodded, but something flickered in his eyes. A faint, uneasy intuition, a premonition. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. "I'll go down to the storeroom to check the inventory," he said, his voice casual. She nodded, turning back to the stoves. The kitchen hummed with its usual rhythmic activity. The sharp sound of knives against cutting boards, the comforting sizzle of oil in the pans, the rich fragrance of simmering tomato sauce and fresh basil filling the air. No one noticed the back door creak open, a cold gust of wind sweeping through the room, chilling everyone in its path. A tall figure stepped inside, their face half covered by a dark coat. When Emily turned, she froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Kyle Mercer, the former manager of Verona House, the man who had once dragged her by the hair in front of 50 diners, humiliating her beyond words, stood there holding a gun. His face gaunt and hollow, his eyes wild and bloodshot, the strong, unmistakable stench of alcohol heavy in the air. "Seems you're enjoying your perfect little life, huh?" he rasped, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "While I lost everything, my job, my reputation. All because of you." The kitchen fell silent, save for the faint, menacing crackle of frying oil in one of the pans. Emily took a slow, deliberate step back, gripping the edge of the cold steel counter, forcing herself to remain calm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "Kyle, you're drunk," she said softly, her voice trembling only slightly. "Put the gun down. We can talk about this." He let out a bitter, broken laugh, full of self-pity. "Talk? What's the point of talking? After you got me blacklisted from the entire industry? After the newspapers turned me into a monster?" She drew a deep breath, steadying her voice against the rising tide of fear. "I didn't destroy you, Kyle," she said firmly. "Your own actions did. You made your choices." His hand trembled violently as he raised the gun higher, pointing it directly at her heart. "You know," he said hoarsely, his voice thick with hatred and regret, "sometimes I wish I hadn't let go of you that night. Maybe everything would have ended sooner." His voice cracked, rage and despair colliding within him. Suddenly, the back door burst open, and Nathan appeared, his eyes taking in the entire scene in an instant, assessing the danger with lightning speed. He stepped forward slowly, his tone eerily calm, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear that filled the room. "Kyle, put the gun down," he said firmly. "You don't want to do this. Think about what you're doing." Kyle swung around, aiming the gun at him, his face contorted with fury. "You," he screamed. "You took everything from me. My job." Her. Nathan's voice remained steady as he advanced inch by inch, not backing down. "No one took anything from you, Kyle," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You lost it because you couldn't take responsibility for your own actions. But it's not too late to stop. You can still choose not to destroy what's left of your life." Kyle laughed, a sharp, broken sound that echoed off the cold metal walls of the kitchen, mocking him. "You talk like you understand," he sneered. "You were a criminal too, weren't you, Mel? Or do you think you've washed that past clean?" Nathan didn't answer the question directly. He met Kyle's gaze, not with hatred or anger, but with something far more disarming: compassion. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "I lost my way too. I let anger and revenge guide me down a dark path. But someone taught me that forgiveness is the only real strength. If I can change, Kyle, then so can you. It's not too." The entire kitchen held its breath, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Kyle blinked, his hands shaking violently now, the gun wavering in his grasp. Emily stepped forward, her voice low but unwavering, filled with a desperate plea. "Kyle, let it end here," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Not with blood, but with a choice. You can still choose to do the right thing." He looked at her, his eyes blurring with tears, the anger slowly draining away, replaced by a profound sense of hopelessness. And then suddenly he dropped the gun. It clattered to the floor with a loud metallic clang, the sound slicing through the heavy tension in the room. Nathan lunged forward instantly, kicking the weapon aside, then knelt down to steady Kyle, who seemed about to collapse. Kyle broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking with the force of his despair. "I've got nothing left," he choked out, his voice barely audible. Nathan's voice trembled with emotion as he answered, his hand firm on Kyle's shoulder. "You still have yourself, Kyle," he said gently. "And that's the only beginning any of us ever get." When the police arrived, Kyle went quietly, offering no resistance. Emily stood frozen, her hands still trembling violently, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Nathan approached her, touching her cheek gently, his eyes full of concern. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't speak. "Why didn't you fight back?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "He could have killed you." He gave her a weary but warm smile, filled with understanding. "Because I made a promise to myself never to use violence again," he explained. "Not out of weakness, but because it's the only way to keep what's human inside me." Emily looked at him, her heart tightening with a mixture of love, gratitude, and profound respect. She understood that this moment wasn't just a rescue. It was proof, final and undeniable, that Nathan Mell had truly changed, that he had left his past behind him and embraced a new life. As the flashing red and blue lights from the police cars spilled through the windows, reflecting against the taste of fire sign outside, Emily knew that the flame within them, the one that had once burned with anger, revenge, and destruction, had become something else entirely now. It was a light that could save, a beacon of hope in a world often shrouded in darkness. 3 months after that night in the smoke-filled kitchen, life had slowly returned to normal at Taste of Fire. But inside Emily Carter, everything had changed profoundly. She and Nathan Mell had made a life-altering decision. They had left Chicago and moved to Napa Valley, where they began a new chapter together, a peaceful, slower-paced life, closer to the earth and far away from the chaotic intensity of the city. Their small house sat nestled among the rolling hills of green vineyards, with an old olive tree standing tall and proud behind it, its wide branches casting a soft, dappled shade. Beneath that tree, Nathan had built a long, sturdy wooden table where they spent their mornings drinking coffee and listening to the gentle rustle of the wind as it sifted through the leaves. Taste of Fire now had a thriving new branch in San Francisco, run by their former apprentices, who were carrying on their legacy of hope and healing. Emily remained a mentor, guiding them from afar, but most of her days were devoted to teaching cooking classes to local youth, those who had once lost their way and were now searching for a path back to themselves, a way to rebuild their lives. "You know," she said one morning as she plucked the season's first ripe olives from the branches, "every time I see someone smile while holding a kitchen knife, I see myself in them. They don't realize it yet, but just having someone believe in you can change everything." Nearby, Nathan stood holding a woven wooden basket, his gaze on her soft and serene, filled with love and admiration. "You've done what it took me half a lifetime to understand," he said slowly, his voice filled with emotion. "That redemption doesn't come from strength or power, but from faith and forgiveness." Emily looked up at him, smiling. "And you taught me that forgiveness isn't weakness," she countered gently. A gentle breeze swept through the vineyard, carrying the rich scent of earth and warm sunlight. She rested a hand on her belly, where new life was quietly growing, a symbol of their renewed hope and love. Nathan noticed the tender gesture and paused, his expression softening with concern. "Are you tired?" he asked, his voice low and tender. She shook her head, her smile radiant. "No, just amazed," she said softly. "Every day I feel something growing inside me, not just the baby, but the certainty that we've truly left the past behind us for good." Nathan stepped closer, crouched down, and gently laid his hand over hers, his touch full of love and reassurance. "I once thought my life would end in darkness," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But then you walked into my life, and everything began again. The warm afternoon sunlight poured over her hair, turning it to spun gold. And in his eyes once shadowed by pain and despair, there was only peace, contentment, and a love that knew no bounds. They sat together beneath the shade of the ancient olive tree, the last light of day spilling across the ground in broken patches, like fragments of old memories pieced back together to create something beautiful and whole. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, her voice a whisper, half prayer, half wonder. "I wonder if one day our child will ask us how we met," she said softly. "What will you tell them?" Nathan chuckled softly, taking her hand in his. "I'll tell them their mother spilled wine on a difficult customer's expensive suit, and, instead of being ruined, she changed an entire world." Emily laughed through her tears, her heart overflowing with love. "And if our child asks why you stood up for her that night, what will you say?" He gazed out toward the rolling hills, his voice fading into the gentle breeze. "Because I couldn't stand to watch a good person be broken," he said honestly. "But maybe I stood up not just to protect her, but to save myself." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, lost in their thoughts and memories. In the distance, the sun sank behind the vineyards, leaving only a faint orange glow across the sky. Emily whispered, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Nathan squeezed her hand gently. "Yes," he replied softly. "From fire to light, from darkness to dawn." The olive branches swayed softly in the gentle breeze, a few leaves drifting down around them, spinning through the golden air like blessings. And in that moment, Emily felt with absolute clarity that every pain, every loss, every scar in their lives had finally found its true meaning. Beneath the old olive tree, where each gentle gust of wind carried the comforting scent of renewal and hope, two souls who had once been lost and broken had finally found their way home. Not in a place, but in each other's hearts, united by a love that had been forged in fire and tempered by forgiveness. It was a crisp autumn morning, with a thin veil of mist draped over the vineyard hills of Napa Valley. Emily Carter stood by the window, a cup of steaming herbal tea warming her hands, listening to the gentle music of the wind as it wove through the branches of the old olive tree in the corner of their garden. Outside, Nathan Mell was carefully trimming the late-season vines, his movements calm and deliberate, his presence a quietly steadying force in her life. The chaos of their past seemed to have drifted far away, like a distant, fading nightmare. Yet sometimes, when the sunlight touched the ground in just the right way, she could still feel the faint warmth of old flames, never fully extinguished, only glowing softly beneath the ashes of their former lives. From the small, cozy kitchen, she heard Nathan's footsteps, then the familiar sound of the back door opening. He set a basket of freshly picked grapes on the table and smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The papers wrote about us again," he said gently, his voice full of affection. "They called Taste of Fire, a story of rebirth and redemption." Emily sat down at the table and unfolded the newspaper. On the front page was their photograph, taken beneath the ancient olive tree, their faces glowing with peace and happiness. A man once branded a Mafia heir and a woman once humiliated in front of strangers. Now they were the founders of a thriving network of restaurants, offering training and hope to hundreds of people who had stumbled and fallen and were now bravely trying to stand again, to reclaim their lives and their dignity. She laid the paper down and looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think fire can really change its color?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Her fingers traced the weathered grain of the wooden table. "Once your fire was anger and revenge, and mine was fear and insecurity," she explained. "But now it's love and compassion, and it's what keeps us alive, what gives us strength. Maybe fire doesn't only burn. Maybe it warms us if we know how to hold it, how to control it." Nathan sat down beside her, his hand finding hers, his touch reassuring and loving. "Fire never truly dies, Emily," he said softly. "It just waits for someone to turn it into light." They sat quietly for a long while, listening to the soft chatter of birds perched on the eaves of the house. In the distance, laughter and cheerful chatter rose from the cooking class. A young orphan boy, who had been taken in by Taste of Fire and given a second chance, was proudly holding up the first pizza he had ever made, his face beaming with pride and accomplishment. Emily watched him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you remember the first day we met?" she asked, her voice full of nostalgia. "I do," Nathan replied, his voice deep and warm. A glass of spilled red wine, a girl humiliated by a cruel boss, and a man who had sworn he'd never raise his hand in anger again. She finished softly, smiling at the memory. "If I hadn't spilled that wine," she continued, "maybe we'd have never met and none of this would have happened." He chuckled softly, his eyes full of love. Sometimes the worst things in life are just the beginning of the best ones. Her cup of tea sat on the table, the steam rising in delicate tendrils, a gentle reminder that the fire of life isn't only meant to destroy, but also to warm the hearts that have been frozen by pain and despair. As dusk descended, the last rays of sunlight filtered through the olive branches, bathing the room in a tender, golden glow, like a quiet blessing. Emily placed her hand on her belly, where the baby within stirred faintly, a gentle reminder of the new life they had created together. And she whispered, her voice filled with hope and love, "The fire in you will be light, not shadow." Nathan heard her and simply pulled her into his arms, holding her close. There was nothing more to say. Their hearts spoke for them. Every loss, every scar, every moment of despair or awakening, all had led them to this very moment, where the fire no longer threatened to consume them but sustained them, warmed them, and lit their way forward. The story of Emily and Nathan is a powerful reminder that no matter how cruel and unforgiving the world can sometimes be, there is always a spark of light within each of us, waiting to be kindled, waiting to shine. Faith, compassion, and forgiveness. These are the transformative forces that can turn even the fires of hell into the warm and comforting hearth of a loving home. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you believe that everyone carries within them their own taste of fire, a pain, a fall, but also the chance to rise stronger and more resilient, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever met someone who changed your life with a single act of kindness? Tell us your story. You never know, it might become the spark that inspires someone else to embrace hope and healing. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the YouTube channel Underworld Love Stories to discover more heartfelt, meaningful stories every day. Tales of love and redemption that will touch your heart and lift your spirit. Thank you for your time. May you have good health, a peaceful heart, and a life filled with light and love. See you in the next video, where together we'll continue to explore stories of healing and transformation that rise from the quiet depths of the human soul.